Tonight we are a country awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Who attacked our country? The evidence we have gathered all points to a collection of loosely affiliated terrorist organizations. There are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries. Thousands of dangerous killers, schooled in the methods of murder, now spread throughout the world like ticking time bombs set to go off without warning. Our war against terror is only beginning.
Despite international arms inspections taking place in Iraq, the Pentagon deploys a massive invasion force in the Persian Gulf. At the United Nations, the US and UK lobby for a resolution authorizing the war on Iraq. Attempting to rally support, the US offers debt relief to many developing countries, but fails to bring most on board. On March 20th, 2003, in violation of international law, the bombing of Iraq begins.
Broadcast 3-4 has a 1859 TOT. We are prosecuting the attack at this time. Station vacuum 4066. Doors open, Bob. Doors open. Come right, point 1 degree. 7 right. And come left, point 1 degree. And setting bomb today. 1, 2, 3. Stop release. And you break left. Weapons away, left, right, left. All weapons away. Right heading. And impact crew. Please listen to this frequency. Heads up, you know. We're at our bingo time. Yeah. And we've got, what city? Dust 3-4, Kim House, no further targets. Request you contact Doom.
During the war, the Americans had a group of targets that they called high-value targets. And these were the Iraqi leaders. And they were bombing them in the cities. Now the problem with this is that you've got thousands of kilos of weapons going into civilian areas. They took 50 shots at the Iraqi leadership, and they did not hit a single one. Well, in this 0 for 50 shooting at the Iraqi leaders, they're killing many, many civilians.
We're facing a problem because we have to receive many injured patients from the bomb. So it's a big job for 5 doctors in this hospital to receiving all injured patients in an area like this. At that time, the refrigerator of the hospital was filled with bodies, and the garden was the only place to keep these bodies.
After a brief and easy campaign, George Bush lands on the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln off the coast of San Diego, California.
The Battle of Iraq is one victory in a war on terror that began on September the 11th, 2001. America is grateful for a job well done.
Now, George Bush said that this was the most humane war ever fought, but civilians still died, and their deaths were not humane.
After hearing so much from Washington about how dangerous Saddam Hussein was, the total lack of resistance of the Iraqi military in and around Baghdad comes as a real surprise.
The resistance that we had wasn't very high at all. The only major threat that we had was the guerrilla warfare, and at times that wasn't much at all. Some traffic accidents, we had one Hummer roll over into a ditch at night, but that's basically the only real threat we had going into Iraq.
The information that was being put out about the danger that Saddam Hussein posed to the United States or United States interests was being grossly exaggerated. Sanctions had weakened Saddam Hussein. The long war with Iran he never really recovered from that war. And frankly, he had been bombed by us with the enforcement of the no-fly zones for a dozen years, basically eliminating any possibility that he would be able to reconstitute his military.
The fundamental problem is that the central justification for going to war, namely that Iraq possesses, I emphasize the word possesses, weapons of mass destruction, which pose a grave danger to the United States as of now, obviously has turned out not to have been true. And that's a very serious problem. It damages American global credibility.
The political perspective that Saddam Hussein must go was not based on intelligence. It was formulated and developed and articulated very publicly during the Clinton administration years, and even somewhat during Bush 1, the predecessor to Bill Clinton. It was articulated through various organizations like the Project for a New American Century, American Enterprise Institute, and others, who built their case that Saddam Hussein needed to go.
Instrumental in planning the removal of Saddam Hussein is the Project for the New American Century. Based in Washington, D.C., this think tank includes such members as Vice President Dick Cheney, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, Defense Advisor Paul Wolfowitz, and Florida Governor Jeb Bush. Politically close to the Israeli Likud party, the group openly advocates the cause of American leadership, the need to increase defense spending significantly, challenging regimes hostile to our interests and values, extending an international order friendly to our security, our prosperity, and our principles. While traditional American conservatives are more focused on taking care of problems at home, these self-proclaimed neoconservatives focus on promoting U.S. economic and military domination over the world.
I think the American public very quickly came to the conclusion after 9/11, not that Iraq was simply or somehow involved in 9/11, but they quickly came to the same conclusion that President Bush did, which was that if you thought through the full ramifications of 9/11, that is a state that harbored terrorists, a state that harbored terrorists who wanted weapons of mass destruction to use, and a state that was potentially producing weapons of mass destruction or had produced weapons of mass destruction. The American public very quickly joined the president in his judgment that Iraq was as much a part of the problem after 9/11 as other states like Afghanistan.
I got a clear sense that what we were doing in the Pentagon, or what the neoconservative group was doing in the Pentagon as far as Middle East policy, was to not just fabricate falsehoods for the Defense Department, but to push that into the mainstream of American media.
Seeking any valid or fabricated evidence against Saddam Hussein, the Bush administration allies with an internationally wanted felon, the self-proclaimed Iraqi opposition leader Ahmed Chalabi.
Ahmed Chalabi has been living in Jordan. He ran away from this country on the 11th of August 1989. He was the chairman of a bank, the Petra Bank, and he was accused of embezzlement. He has been condemned in absentia by a military court in Jordan for 22 years of prison, and he's responsible of over $1 billion of losses. I mean, this is what the court has said.
The main thing that happened was the influence of Ahmed Chalabi. In the office that I was at, I saw Ahmed Chalabi. He would come in to visit Bill Ludi. There was a military officer working in the Office of Special Plans whose job was described to me as the Ahmed Chalabi's handler. He would set up meetings downtown. They traveled to London to meet with members of the INC. Ahmed was a key source of a lot of these stories, that Saddam Hussein had vast quantities of undetermined weapons of mass destruction that he was going to either use directly against U.S. interests or give to terrorists who would do the same thing.
In June of 2004, accused this time of counterfeiting Iraqi money, Ahmed Chalabi runs again from justice. He flees from Iraq, where he had been appointed by the Bush administration to the so-called Iraqi Governing Council. For President Bush, this comes as the latest embarrassment surrounding the war in Iraq. In April of 2004, State Secretary Colin Powell himself publicly admits that, had he known that Iraq didn't really pose a threat to peace, he wouldn't have supported the war. He blames the CIA, headed by George Tenet, for providing faulty intelligence, but he quickly adds that President Bush was right in his decision to remove what he calls a terrible despotic leader. John Negroponte was appointed U.S. ambassador to the UN by President Bush in 2001, and as such became the U.S. salesman of the war on Iraq at the United Nations. In the 1980s, while John Negroponte was ambassador to Honduras, the CIA was involved in covert operations in Central America, including training of local death squads responsible for the disappearance of many Central American leftist opponents. In June of 2004, Negroponte is appointed U.S. ambassador to Iraq. Given the Bush administration's apparent concern for dictatorship in Iraq, John Negroponte's appointment comes as a surprising choice.
We're not too worried about dictators as long as they're on our side, do what we tell them. Democracy is not the reason we went in there. The main reason is geostrategic regional dominance, which is the one that relates to energy supplies. Another reason for this invasion occupation at the time that we did it had to do with the pressure to lift sanctions. There was a huge pressure building to lift sanctions on Iraq. Had sanctions been lifted or partially lifted, Iraq could have been filled with Europeans, Russians, Chinese, Japanese, all kinds of folks, no Americans or British folk, but we and the UK had been bombing Iraq for 12 years. Had sanctions been lifted with Saddam Hussein still in charge, we would have gotten no contracts and no opportunities to invest in Iraq. But furthermore, we would have lost the ability to attack Iraq at any time because Iraq would have been filled with foreigners. And then the other aspect to me is a smaller one, but it has to do with Saddam Hussein's decision in November of 2000 to switch to the euro for all of his oil for food exports. He had been on the dollar for decades, and he decided to switch to the euro. Had he gone into full production of his oil capability, and had he continued to trade oil on the euro and not the dollar, this would have actually had a financial impact on the United States in that central banks around the world would be more favorable towards the euro and less to the dollar.
The idea that the United States needed to go to war with Iraq over the issue of oil, I think, is just wrong-headed. So there was no push, to get more oil by getting rid of Saddam. The truth is we had plenty of oil in the world and the supplies were enough.
In June 2004, just one day's worth of oil consumption would represent a line of barrels long enough to encircle the Earth. With almost half used for fuel and the other half used for plastics and chemicals, oil is indispensable in every single aspect of our modern everyday lives. The world population has been able to increase over the course of 1 century from about 1.5 billion to 6.5 billion, only because oil has allowed for more food to be grown and distributed than ever before.
World food production is so dependent upon hydrocarbon energy. All commercial fertilizers are made out of natural gas, which produces ammonia. All pesticides are made out of oil. Now with agribusiness, you drive an oil-powered machine to plow, you drive an oil-powered machine to plant, then you fertilize it with natural gas, then you irrigate it with water that's pumped by electric pumps where the electricity comes from burning natural gas or oil in most cases. Then you spray it with oil pesticides, then you harvest it with an oil-powered vehicle, and the bottom line is that we eat 10 calories of hydrocarbon energy for every calorie of food consumed on the planet.
All around the world, oil consumption is exploding. New gigantic markets, such as those in India and China, have opened up to modern consumerism and have driven the global need for oil through the roof.
China, with its red-hot economy, just passed Japan as the second largest importer of oil on the planet. China's economy has had like a 10% growth rate. It's on fire. The Chinese people are demanding more computers, automobiles. Chinese auto sales up 100% in 1 year. GM sales in China up 300% in 1 year. That's what keeps the American economy going.
La superpuissance consomme.
The United States, the only superpower, uses 20 million barrels of oil every day, and it is estimated that it will need 25 million barrels per day around 2020. While its own reserves are dwindling, the U.S. only produces 5 to 6 million barrels per day and imports almost 3/4 of the oil it needs.
Satellite imaging applied to oil exploration has confirmed a stark reality. With increasing consumption and diminishing reserves, the world is rapidly running out of oil. At the current rate of production, the West will be first to hit the zero mark by 2010. At this point, both the United States and Europe will depend entirely on outside sources for their oil. Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, while self-sufficient today, are next and due to run out by 2013. With its exploding oil consumption, Asia will run dry in 2018. The reality, however, is that major conflicts are likely to erupt before any of these players actually runs out of oil.
Comment peut-on admettre?
Is it conceivable that the United States, that dominates the world with its technology, its economy, its military, its space programs, is it conceivable that such a power would let itself fall at the mercy of the outside world for an energy source indispensable to its existence? This is impossible.
Right after the Bush administration took office, Vice President Cheney took over and instituted what was called the National Energy Policy Development Group, or NEPDG. Most people just call it the Energy Task Force, the Vice President's Energy Task Force. It operated in secret from January of 2001 until May of 2001. 7 pages of records were finally released out of who knows how many thousands of pages. And what those showed was, they were maps, maps of all the oil fields in Iraq, the oil fields in the United Arab Emirates, which would be, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Oman, all the Emirates, and all the maps of the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, along with lists of all the countries and the companies that had oil development contracts in that region. That's very telling. My analysis of those it confirms, first of all, that 60% of all the recoverable oil on the planet is located in an area maybe the size of Kansas, very small area. But that's clearly what they were looking at.
we had been dissatisfied, as were the Saudis, with our bases in Saudi Arabia. Huge pressure to move out of Saudi Arabia. Where would we move to? We had saturated Kuwait with our bases. The base we have in Qatar is too far south. Certainly Iran is not an option. Turkey was becoming problematic because they have democracy in Turkey and they actually have to consent to our presence there. So we're looking for a new place to put bases, which will allow us to exercise political, some economic, and certainly military power in the region.
Iraq was selected. It met the required conditions. First condition is it was understood that it was completely defenseless. You don't attack a country if it can defend itself. Secondly, it was important because it has the second largest oil reserves in the world, and it's right at the heart of the main oil-producing region of the world. So establishing a client state in Iraq, presumably with military bases, would put the United States in an even stronger position than before.
Additionally, with U.S. forces all around the Gulf and controlling one of the world's largest oil exporters, the U.S. would have strategic control over Persian Gulf oil. And that's power. In that position, the U.S. can cut off oil to anyone it wants by stopping ships from going out of the Persian Gulf and creating an embargo. So I think it's much more oil for power than it is oil for money.
So I'm not somebody who thinks that going to war with Iraq for its oil was anywhere A, in the administration's own mind, or B, a real factor in the decision to go to war. But having said that, I also think that it's a good thing that, you know, Iraq, if it's stabilized, if it becomes a decent government, does have these reserves of oil. I think it's very important that we in the West not be so dependent upon oil from countries like Saudi Arabia, I think, or countries like Iran. I'd rather have our oil coming from a country that's friendly to the West.
A year and a half after the start of George Bush's controversial war on Iraq, the Iraqi population has grown increasingly hostile to its U.S. occupants. Sporadic violence has given way to organized resistance. Sabotage of pipelines has disrupted the flow of Iraqi oil. As a result, the price of oil on the international market has been driven to record highs. The seeds of chaos, however, were planted at the very time of the U.S. invasion, when GIs did nothing to stop hordes of looters from destroying Iraqi institutions.
As regards with the looting, when we were watching the looters, it's very interesting to see because they were grabbing anything and everything they could. They were grabbing doors, screws from doors, air conditioners, chairs, couches, anything that they can get their hands on, they took.
The looters, you know, after the war, they started coming in with weapons. So it was a fight, you know, crossfire between us. The US Army went in this area. We were able to talk to them, to the commander, to give us protection.
One of the things that's interesting in the focus of what the troops did when they invaded is they immediately seized the oil fields. But the focus on seizing the oil fields right away seemed to distract the forces from seizing other very important sites, for instance, securing the nuclear facilities.
While the U.S. military quickly secures Iraqi oil assets, the well-known Al-Tuwaitha Nuclear Research Center, some 15 miles south of Baghdad, is left totally unattended. As a result, local villagers make off with radioactive barrels they empty on the ground and recycle for storing food and water. Made aware of it, the U.S. authority fails to take proper action to protect the civilian population. Greenpeace steps in and, after surveying the entire area, offers the villagers a brand new replacement barrel for every contaminated barrel returned. The dangerous containers are quickly recovered and evacuated.
The focus on seizing the oil field forgot many other sites that in reality pose a much greater threat of terrorism, which was supposedly what this was about.
But in Iraq, radiation comes in other forms as well. Like during the 1991 Gulf War and the war in Kosovo, depleted uranium rounds were used again by the U.S. military, this time including the center of Baghdad. They lie around for anyone to see and touch. A Geiger counter will give a reading of between 5 and 15 pulses per minute in a typical environment. This depleted uranium round will trigger 10,000 pulses in about 40 seconds. This type of ammunition is radioactive because it is made of nuclear waste referred to as uranium-238 or depleted uranium. This material is left over from the processing of uranium-234 used for atomic bombs and uranium-235 used in nuclear power plants. Long considered toxic garbage, it found an extremely controversial application in the making of cheap, high-perforation shells. Uranium-238 remains radioactive for 4.5 billion years, and its toxicity reveals itself as soon as particles are inhaled or ingested. Cancer and birth defects are the most common side effects.
The United States military forces used 320 tons of depleted uranium in the first Gulf War in 1991. The difference between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War is very significant, and that is that in the second war, we have seen a lot more depleted uranium use in populated areas, in urban centers. American planes, A-10 Warthog planes that used DU rounds, the 30mm DU rounds, fired at targets in cities.
These particular rounds were found inside the compound of one of Saddam Hussein's palaces in Baghdad. This compound is now guarded by American soldiers who are totally unaware of the contamination. Ironically, this particular palace was chosen by U.S. authorities to house their so-called Coalition Provisional Authority. As its boss, the White House appointed the former managing director of consulting firm Henry Kissinger and Associates, Mr. Paul Bremer.
The other key task of the coalition is to help build the democratic institutions to safeguard Iraq's newfound freedom. We want to ensure that the governing council, which emerges, is truly representative of all Iraqis, Shia and Sunni, men and women, Kurds and Arabs, secular and religious, tribal and urban. Democracy is on the move in Iraq.
Free elections would mean, whether in Iraq or any other Arab country, that Islamists will take power, because they are the majority. And in particularly in Iraq, it will most definitely be Shiite who will win, because they represent 60% of the population.
نحن لم نرحب بالاحتلال.
We didn't welcome the invasion.
لأن رأينا كان هو أن لا تقع الحرب.
Because our viewpoint was that war must not occur.
وتكون مسؤولية التغيير مسؤولية الشعب العراقي.
And the responsibility of changing had been on the authority of the Iraqi people.
The Shiite majority, of course, would play a role in any democratic government. I suppose they decided to improve relations with Iran, as in fact the countries of the region have been trying to do over strong U.S. objections for years. Would the U.S. tolerate that?
إيراني علاقات تاريخية.
The relationship between the Iraqi people and the Iranian people is historical relations.
وبالتالي فالعلاقات نسعى لأن تكون وطيدة وجيدة مع إيران.
So we strive to the relation to be good, to be brotherhood with Iran and with other countries.
Since 1979, when the U.S. Embassy personnel in Tehran were taken hostage by the Islamic Revolution of Ayatollah Khomeini, the U.S. government has kept Iran in its gun sight. The Americans' hatred for the Shia regime of Tehran grew even stronger when the Iranians became the sponsors of the Hezbollah, a violent Lebanon-based militant group responsible for many attacks on Israel since the 1980s. Free elections today in Iraq would mean the immediate victory of a potentially pro-Iranian Shia majority, something that Washington and Israel would never tolerate. Instead, the U.S.-led coalition Provisional Authority appointed a council of so-called Iraqi representatives.
لأن أساساً أنا هاي الحكومة جديدة ما عندي علم عنها.
لا تتوقعي راح تمثل الشعب العراقي؟ راح تمثل الأمريكان ما راح تمثل الشعب العراقي.
نريد ابن العراق اللي كان عايش تحت المطرقة الصدامية، العذاب اللي شعر به العراق هنا عاش به، أما اللي كان عايش في رفاه وديمقراطية وحرية هذا ما. احنا نريد ابن البلد يمثل البلد.
The council, I don't know who are they, but I don't think it is representing a broad of the Iraqi people.
The discrepancy between what Iraqis want for their country and how Washington sees freedom and democracy is again illustrated by the appointment at the Iraqi Governing Council of such a corrupt individual as Ahmed Chalabi. Installing officials more loyal to money than to Iraq seems to be Washington's first step in opening up opportunities for U.S. corporations.
American corporations stand to win a huge amount of money in the current reconstruction process in Iraq, and many of those people and corporations have very close ties to the administration. Many contracts so far were given without any sort of bidding process that was done.
And so you've got U.S. companies like MCI in line to run the telephone system. As I said, you've got a company like DynCorp that's helping them redo their justice system. You've got companies like Apt Associates, a U.S. consultant working on educational issues. You've already got American companies writing the textbooks in Iraq. You've got essentially a privatized occupation where Paul Bremer, the head of the Provisional Authority, a U.S. government appointee, is making all the decisions.
On the question of privatization, there's no reason at all why the service sector as well cannot be brought up and become a source of economic activity and therefore in the end also of revenues. But realistically, over the next 18 months, we are looking more or less at revenues from the oil sector.
What we've seen was a very quiet plan to privatize Iraq's oil. This is not really surprising from an administration that is run by former oil executives.
The first companies that were allowed to buy Iraqi oil post-occupation included Chevron, Condoleezza Rice's former company. She was a board member. They named a tanker after her.
Just recently, the president has decided to take more direct control over the reconstruction of Iraq by having Condoleezza Rice essentially create a National Security Council entity that will allow her to sort of manage the reconstruction from the NSC.
In terms of refurbishing the existing oil production facilities and potentially bringing on new fields online, I imagine that a number of those contracts will go to American firms.
Halliburton is a multi-billion-dollar American corporation specializing in building U.S. military bases and oil infrastructures worldwide. In May of 2004, Halliburton is awarded the contracts to refurbish Iraq's oil infrastructures, including wells, pipelines, and refineries.
I mean, how does it look to the rest of the world when the first big contract for rebuilding Iraq goes to Halliburton, Cheney's ex-company, and he is still getting money from that firm? He's getting $150,000 to $200,000 a year in deferred compensation. He still owns stock options. that he can exercise when he chooses. So he still has financial ties to this company, even as it is the biggest company profiting not only in Iraq, but from the whole war on terrorism, because they're running the bases in Afghanistan, in Uzbekistan. They built the prison at Guantanamo, where they're putting the suspects incommunicado and so forth. The second big contract goes to Bechtel, which George Shultz and other major Republican figures are a part of.
Our contract with USAID is actually quite broad. We have responsibilities for infrastructure reconstruction in 7 different sectors. First of all, the port of Qasr. The second sector is roads, bridges, and railroads. The third area is the buildings and facilities. And this primarily are schools, medical facilities like clinics, and some ministerial buildings. The next sector is power. Another sector is water and wastewater, including irrigation. The final sector is aviation. Oh, and excuse me, one area I forgot to mention, one sector was the communications.
American defense contractors made a fortune selling to the U.S. military the weapons and the bombs that destroyed Iraq. Now Bechtel, Halliburton, and the many other American contractors will make a fortune off contracts to rebuild Iraq's infrastructures. Regardless if the work is really done or not, the Iraqis will eventually be forced to pay for it with their oil revenues. In the meantime, not only did U.S. taxpayers pay for the war, but they will also have to front the money for the reconstruction as well.
Our contract is funded by the U.S. government, so consequently it's U.S. taxpayer funding that has been used to supply the funding for our contract. So all of the money that we will expend is U.S. taxpayer money.
The $87 billion that the administration has asked for reconstruction and military operations in Iraq is an enormous sum of money, especially in the United States, where we're suffering from large deficits. Just 2 years ago, before the attacks on 9/11, we had a $127 billion surplus. Now we're into over a $500 billion deficit.
I think people would be quite foolish if, in fact, they thought that money being spent on Iraq would be better spent on supplementing, Medicare or schools here. Our schools get plenty of money. Our priority must be fixing the problem of Iraq, and I think it's penny wise, as we say, and a pound foolish to think otherwise.
Well, President Bush is trying to present the $87 billion package as being for the Iraqi people. But if you look at the package, first of all, the majority of it is for the military occupation. It's not for the rebuilding.
Out of the $87 billion the Bush administration has requested from Congress, a whopping 2/3 is actually going to maintaining U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq. A substantial share of this money is also going to Kellogg Brown and Root, a subsidiary of Dick Cheney's Halliburton Corporation that builds and maintains U.S. military bases abroad. And while these $87 billion are only meant for 2004, similar or larger expenses can be expected for each year the U.S. will spend occupying Iraq. 1 year after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, none of the promises of improvement has been fulfilled, and deep resentment has built over frustration among the Iraqi population.
ولهذا قلنا بوش من يطب للعراق ما قاتلنا من أجل نرتاح، نريد نرتاح، ولهذا طب بوش علينا فصار له 4 أشهر كل شيء ماكو، لا فلوس لا موف لا تعيين لا عمل لا سفر كل شيء، أمال ماكو. جاي نشرب مي من الشط، هذا الشط من نهر دجلة،
الحركات
نشرب مي، الكهرباء جارينها من المستشفى، ومرات يقطعوها علينا. هم يقطعوها علينا. ويقطعون الماء. حرب.
Everything is worse regarding the water supply, regarding the electricity and air conditioning. We know the US forces is powerful. Why they didn't do something, even little thing for us, even for the hospital.
متنا كهرباء ماكو؟
لا كهرباء ما بيها بغداد كلها ما بيها منطقة الجهال بنحرق
متنا بننحرق جهات تمرضة شنو؟ كهرباء ماكو؟
استوى امريكا شوف
هاي امريكا ايش كبرها؟ امريكا ايش كبرها؟ ديزل ما تجيب لها ما تنصب لنا كهرباء؟
Many civilians lost their homes during the U.S. bombing of Iraq. Some now live in temporary camps administered by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees.
زوجتي توفت بسبب الإهمال بالخدمات، كهرباء، ماء، النظافة، والسكن غير سليم غير لائق يعني بالإنسان الحالة اللي احنا بيها يعني بالوقت الحاضر.
There's no doubt that there's a great degree of frustration on the part of some Iraqis, and particularly those in Baghdad who don't have the access to public services that they would like, in particular electricity, water, and access to petrol, for example, at petrol stations.
Crumbling oil infrastructures after 12 years of U.S.-led embargo, along with sabotage, play a part in the lack of availability of gas on Iraq's streets. But the main factor is that Washington wants to flood the world market with cheap Iraqi oil to undercut OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. For the Iraqis, this painful contradiction in such an oil-rich country is only proof that the Americans came to steal their national wealth.
For a very short time, the Americans appeared as the liberators in Iraq, and people were definitely cheerful and happy to be relieved from this very bloody regime. However, with time passing, when their daily life has not improved, where their dignity was still at stake, where the basics were not provided, of course that there was a big disappointment, and we don't see anymore the Iraqis being cheerful. At contrary, they're blaming the Americans. So the Americans have transformed the situation from the liberators to, in fact, the accused party, because all this frustration is coming out against the Americans.
The situation now in Baghdad is miserable.
There is no safety in the street. There is no security in Iraq.
We're afraid to go 10 meters out of university or 10 meters out of our house.
There's many attacks from the thieves.
The thieves, they're entering homes and even kill people inside that home.
I think it is not a liberation of Iraq. It is a destruction of the country.
Get back the security. This is not a liberation. Believe me, this is a chaos. We need a security. We need a security, please.
While the U.S. military and the Iraqi police are busy tracking down Iraqi opponents to the occupation, common criminals are thriving. Lawlessness and insecurity have become the norm and contribute to the further decay of Iraqi society.
البوليس العراقي ذيك المرأة البارحة باق من عندنا 450,000 دينار ها واخذ نص خمس ومسدس زين وضرب اختي زين احنا ماكو واحد ابويا.
How would you expect a country to go back to normal situation when there is no security? How would you expect employees, doctors, to go to their hospitals, places of work, when they are still worried about their safety?
We put in the top of the list of problems is the security. This is important more than the needs of drugs, important more than the electricity, more than the water. Because when there is no security, no one will stay in the hospital.
What in the aftermath has proven to be so difficult is winning the peace, and this was what the U.S. had not actively planned for. They had not planned for dealing with the issues surrounding reconstruction, how to turn the power back on, how to get the water going. And this is why that the Iraqi people are starting to rise up, because all the administration has offered them so far has been empty promises.
They take the gold and the money and they take the petrol and they don't give us freedom.
We don't need Americans to stay here because after 1 month we will fight them, believe me.
Anybody come in Iraq to occupy our Iraq, I will fight them against them. Bye-bye.
There are definitely Iraqis who refuse the idea of an occupation. They don't necessarily are, fighting for the sake of Saddam or the return of Saddam. Most probably it is not the case. But they believe in a free Iraq. They don't want to see Americans ruling their country or being responsible of their territory.
U.S. GIs antagonize simple Iraqis every day by searching them at random on the streets and in their homes. Thousands of suspected opponents are rounded up and taken to the prisons of the former Saddam Hussein regime and to an off-limit detention camp inside Baghdad's international airport that has still not been reopened.
The United States military police has been rounding up hundreds and thousands of people from Baghdad, some of whom were looters, some of whom were just in the wrong time and the wrong place.
أنا مسكوني قبل 3 أيام الأمريكان اللي بيحكوا عنهم الحرية والديمقراطية والأصولية، مسكوني بهدلوني، والله لو ميت قاتليني أرحم ما عملوا فينا هيك ما عملوا.
The conditions in the airport and in Abu Ghraib are extremely bad. They constitute cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment. For the first 3 days, the detainees in the airport were surrounded by razor wire and they were kept under the open sun.
In May of 2004, a scandal would erupt worldwide over the mistreatment of Iraqi prisoners by U.S. forces. These now infamous photos would become one more catalyst for anger in Iraq and throughout the Muslim world. While political arrests multiply, sporadic incidents quickly escalate into major uprisings.
If there's a base in Iraq that's American troops and British troops, I don't think they will be thought of as occupiers. On the other hand, if in fact things don't go well in Iraq and we have to stay there for a very long time fighting Iraqis, then I think in fact a good part of the population of Iraq will think we're occupiers.
In July of 2004, the Pentagon admits that a large part of the population is supporting the uprising and that the war will probably never be won completely. For GIs who were told they were coming as liberators, the real Iraq war has just begun. For the many thousands of GIs who will return home wounded, life will never be the same. For hundreds of others, the journey home will be in a casket.
Three Marines from the Camp Pendleton go my home and say Suarez has died in combat in Iraq. But more late, we know about the real situation. The real situation is Jesus stepped the cluster bomb, American cluster bomb. And my family feeling very angry because the government covered the real situation.
My son was killed on July 24th outside Mosul, Iraq. What happens is when the soldiers come home, they come home at night and the families are not allowed to be there. When my son was flown from Dover to Burbank, I asked to be there and they said no, I could not be. And I would have wanted to have been there when my son came back to the States.
Fearing for their popularity, the Bush administration bans any media coverage of the GI's ordeal and any pictures of their returning caskets. In response, American veterans from various cities have put up symbolic cemeteries to commemorate the fallen soldiers.
Even though we're recognizing the Americans that have died in Iraq, we don't want people to think that we're ignoring the Iraqi casualties, because there are tens of thousands of innocent Iraqis that had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein that have lost their lives over there as a result of our invasion. And that's true with the people in Afghanistan as well. More innocent civilians have died in Afghanistan as a result of high-altitude bombing by the United States Air Force than died in the September 11th attacks in New York. We need to keep these things in mind.
Practically forgotten by the world, the war in Afghanistan is still going on. After 3 years of U.S. occupation and constant search and destroy missions, Osama bin Laden is nowhere to be found. Very few Al-Qaeda elements have been killed or captured, and many Taliban have crossed the border into Pakistan to regroup. While achieving modest results on the ground, the U.S. military is building major bases and seems to be settling in Afghanistan for the long haul. Besides fighting terrorism, was oil somehow a factor in the U.S. decision to invade this extremely poor and desolate country? While Afghanistan has minimal oil resources, to the north the former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan possess substantial oil and natural gas, which Russia exploited before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990.
Already we have American bases and troops in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, in Kyrgyzstan, and the Russians clearly are very nervous about this. China is another big player. China would like to extract a lot of this oil and gas and perhaps try and ship it to China. So I think, in the future, we may well see a kind of three-way competition between Russia, China, and the United States for the resources of Central Asia.
U.S. military bases may now have replaced Soviet bases throughout Central Asia, but for American oil companies, a problem remains. Where to run pipelines without passing through the territory of competing powers? With Russia to the north, Azerbaijan across the Caspian Sea to the west, Iran to the southwest, India to the southeast, and China to the east, apparently running pipelines through Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Indian Ocean seems to be the answer. Such a project was actually conceived of by the California-based Unocal Oil Company in the early 1990s. Simple on the map, the project becomes difficult to implement on the ground for two reasons: the harsh mountainous terrain of Afghanistan and a persistent civil war that originates from a turning point in Afghan history, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. (1979). Fulfilling an old dream of the Russian Tsars, the Soviet Red Army crosses the border into Afghanistan. Under pretext of supporting the existing communist government, Afghanistan is brought under Soviet rule. A local resistance immediately organizes itself against the communists. From farmers to warlords, their rallying call is the religion of Islam, and they take the name of Mujahideen, or holy fighters. In the 1960s, Soviet help to the Viet Minh had played a major part in the U.S. losing the Vietnam War. 20 years later, Washington is presented with a chance to get even. U.S. help to the Mujahideen would now become key to defeating the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Well, the American CIA supported the Mujahideen at the behest of the Pakistani intelligence service, the Inter-Services Intelligence. This was an ISI plan to bring in foreign Islamic fighters from all over the world to fight the Afghan cause, to make it into a kind of international jihad against communism. The Americans, President Reagan really liked the idea, the CIA liked the idea, they backed it with money, the Pakistanis provided the logistics, bringing in thousands of people from about 32 different countries in the Muslim world. And that really formed the basis of Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda means the base in Arabic. It refers to the Afghan camp, paid for and operated by the CIA in the 1980s to train anti-Soviet Mujahideen fighters. A key CIA asset built and oversaw the Al-Qaeda training camp, Osama bin Laden.
Bin Laden comes from a very rich Saudi family that was much favored by the royal family in Saudi Arabia. When he came to Pakistan, to Peshawar in the 1980s, he was favored very much by the CIA and by the ISI because he was considered to be almost a royal. It was like having a royal prince, fighting the Soviets and on your side. So he, secondly, because his family was in construction, he helped build many of the CIA-funded Mujahideen strongholds.
1988, the alliance between the CIA and the Afghan resistance prevails over the Red Army. On the verge of collapse, the Soviet Union pulls out of Afghanistan. Victorious, the U.S. immediately disengages itself from Afghanistan. Armed to the teeth, different Afghan Mujahideen factions start competing for power. While simple farmers go back to their lands, warlords revert to feudal violence and sink the country into a bloody civil war. In 1994, tired of 6 years of continuous violence and crimes, tens of thousands of Afghan peasants rise up against the warlords under the leadership of one cleric, Mullah Omar. Educated in Pakistani religious schools called madrasas, thousands of young Afghan refugees quickly join in their fight. The grassroots rebellious movement becomes known as the Taliban, or religious students.
So I have been a very close witness to Taliban in power. They had come from the villages. They belonged to the poorest sections of the Afghan society, and now they were in power. They had the gun. They were trying to impose their version of Islam and culture on the people of Afghanistan. And also because they were a fighting force. They were not a political movement. It was an armed group.
And Pakistan and the Saudis convinced the Americans to come back and support this group because it was considered an anti-Iranian group, and it was also going to try and help secure southern Afghanistan.
In 1995, the CIA jumps on the bandwagon and decides to help the Taliban conquer all of Afghanistan. Awash with new cash, weapons, and pickup trucks, the Taliban gradually sweep across Afghanistan and in 1996 capture the capital, Kabul. The warlords opposing them flee to the north and become the Northern Alliance. Washington, however, had a very precise motivation in backing up the Taliban. Striking a deal with them would allow the U.S. to run pipelines across Afghanistan once the country is stabilized under Taliban leadership. The Americans, however, are not the only ones to have thought of this.
Well, in the 90s, there was intense competition between an American oil company, Unocal, which was backed very heavily by the State Department, and Bridas, an Argentinian oil company. They were both involved in setting up a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to Pakistan across Taliban-controlled Afghanistan.
In order to support Unocal's bid, the Clinton administration initiates negotiations with the Taliban government. The Taliban, however, already have a well-known track record of human rights violations and brutal abuses against women. Under pressure from women's rights organizations, President Clinton finally demands improvement of human rights in Afghanistan. The Argentinian oil company Bridas doesn't ask such things of the Taliban regime and eventually gets favored by them. As violence grips Afghanistan once again, Unocal officially abandons the pipeline project in 1998. The Taliban regime now loses almost all international support.
They were committing excesses against the people, and what made the Americans angry was the Taliban decision to give refuge to Osama bin Laden, and they refused to deliver Mr. bin Laden to the Americans, saying he was their guest and he was innocent.
Already a fugitive wanted for allegedly attacking U.S. interests around the world, Osama bin Laden seeks refuge in Afghanistan in 1994. With a group of fellow Al-Qaeda veterans from the war against the Soviets, he helps the Taliban conquer all of Afghanistan. His fighting alongside the Taliban doesn't deter the U.S. covert support for their cause. In 1998, however, Osama bin Laden is accused of masterminding attacks on U.S. embassies in Africa. President Clinton has a volley of Tomahawk missiles fired at Al-Qaeda bases in Afghanistan, and the U.S. officially abandons its Afghan pipeline project.
The first building hit at high floor by the first plane is in smoke.
On September 11, 2001, American network television relays the U.S. government's immediate finger-pointing at Osama bin Laden and the Afghan Taliban.
We all know perfectly well that the Taliban has been housing and comforting Osama bin Laden.
The Taliban have been warned. The U.S. is going to retaliate against Afghanistan itself.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Even though the alleged terrorist list doesn't include any Afghans, President Bush consults neither the U.S. Congress nor the United Nations and attacks Afghanistan within a month of September 11th.
Certainly, the U.S. has been involved in many acts of indiscriminate bombing and killing and targeting of Afghans, and that has created enormous resentment, especially immediately after the war when they were trying to hunt down bin Laden. There were enormous bombing incidents which I think were completely inappropriate to the target, given that you were aiming to bomb maybe a few Taliban, but you were using these enormous munitions, killing a lot of civilians.
After an intense bombing campaign, the Taliban leadership and their Al-Qaeda guests disappear inside the country's complex ramification of mountains, valleys, caves, and tunnels. The U.S. military easily sweeps through primitive Afghanistan without encountering noticeable resistance.
Our mission is to kill, capture, deny sanctuary to anti-coalition forces. That includes Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and any other element that might be against the coalition.
After the Bush administration blurred the distinction between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, some 600 Taliban from top to bottom are rounded up along with suspected Al-Qaeda members and deported to the U.S. Navy base of Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Deporting prisoners of war to a third-party country violates international laws, but the U.S. government denies that the Taliban and suspected Al-Qaeda members are war prisoners. Instead, they are called enemy combatants, a fabricated term meant to bypass the Geneva Convention on the treatment of POWs because they don't wear a uniform and don't answer to a traditional military hierarchy.
The United States says, well, there's a war against terrorists of global reach, or a war against Al-Qaeda, and that we can hold people as long as that war continues. The problem is this is not a war that has any likelihood of ever ending in our lifetimes and may never end. These people have been held, at this point, some of them for almost 2 years, without any legal procedure. Some were clearly detained in the context of fighting in Afghanistan. Some apparently were detained because they were taxi drivers or students who were in the wrong place at the wrong time and somehow got picked up. Some people were sent to Guantanamo because the United States has been offering rewards that would lead to the capture of members of Al-Qaeda, and that quest for the bounty has led Northern Alliance people to point the finger at somebody who was not in fact a terrorist, but they get taken off, they get the money.
America and Afghanistan are now allies against terror.
As the next step of the so-called Operation Enduring Freedom, the U.S. government installs Afghanistan's new president, former UNICAL consultant Hamid Karzai.
Chairman Hamid Karzai.
Three years later, despite promises made by the U.S. government of liberating and improving the country, the situation in Afghanistan is still as precarious as before.
We're trying to build the infrastructure within Afghanistan. We're trying to create the conditions that will enable security and prosperity to take hold in this country.
Well, you know, we should understand that only the first road, the Kabul-Kandahar highway, has been rebuilt in Afghanistan and was opened only in December 2003, which means that 2.5 years have passed since 9/11, over which very little work has been done.
Only, by the way, 24 to 25% of the population in Afghanistan have access to safe water, and about 12 to 13% of the population have access to adequate sanitation. And the needs include essential medicines and drugs, childhood diseases, tuberculosis, malnutrition, water and sanitation, and community health. But we are implementing the programs ourselves. This is not the case in other countries.
Another tragedy for Afghanistan. The country has been littered with some 10 million landmines over the last 2 decades of conflict. Every single day, between 10 and 20 people lose their limbs or their lives, mostly children and peasants. As a result, the International Committee of the Red Cross operates the largest factory in Afghanistan, making prosthetic limbs. While this curse will probably never be completely resolved, at least the United Nations and local NGOs are doing their best to demine the roadsides with the help of dogs, training, and equipment provided in great part by the German government. The latest addition to this horrendous nightmare is unexploded American cluster bombs.
This is the BLU-97, which was used in Afghanistan as well as Iraq. In Afghanistan, the U.S. military dropped 1,228 cluster bombs, which releases almost 250,000 bomblets. Those are figures that we obtained from the U.S. military after our mission. In many cases, the bomblets do not explode on impact. After the conflict, they lie around and can be set off by a number of things. They can be set off by children throwing rocks at them or picking them up and playing with them. They can be set off by farmers who make contact with them with plows. In some cases, they can be set off by the heat.
Another failure for the U.S.-sponsored Karzai government, opium poppies, eradicated by the Taliban as part of their proclaimed moral order, have been reintroduced by the Northern Alliance warlords. In 2003, with a mighty 3/4 of the world production, Afghanistan has become the world's #1 producer of heroin.
All the warlords are deeply involved, either in selling or trafficking in opium or actually in providing resources for farmers to grow it. The Americans have not done anything. Neither the coalition forces nor the NATO-led peacekeeping forces, and nor has President Karzai.
Opium trafficking is a severe catalyst for trouble. Not only does it divert local farmers from growing food, thus contributing to food shortage, but it allows warlords to buy more weapons, grow stronger, and become more violent.
The international forces there are only controlling, really, Kabul. And the rest of the country has fallen back under the traditional warlords who are not known for good government.
You can say that situation completely has not changed when Taliban were in power, where the warlords and the fundamentalist military commander are stronger. You can say the same violence and the same atrocities against men and women both.
The Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, or RAWA, is an organization devoted to women's rights in Afghanistan. Its activities include documenting women's abuse by means of hidden cameras, providing literacy classes for women in a society that discourages their education, and running orphanages for hundreds of children who lost their parents during the successive Afghan wars. Though totally harmless, Rawa was banned under the Soviet occupation, banned by the Taliban, and remains banned today by the U.S.-sponsored Northern Alliance government.
Today you can see that few women are taking off their burqas. They are ready to join different jobs, or they are ready to send their girls to school. It's just in Kabul, not in other villages, not in other parts of Afghanistan. It's only in Kabul that you can see a few changes. There's not very huge difference between Taliban and Northern Alliance. Both of them are fundamentalists, both of them are terrorists.
The U.S. government never concerns itself with the ethics of local groups they ally themselves with in order to take on a common enemy. In Afghanistan today, warlords are again ransacking the country and warring against each other. Regardless, the U.S. military narrowly focuses on hunting down Taliban and Al-Qaeda elements who are conducting raids over the Pakistani border.
We aggressively seek anti-coalition forces. We're looking for them. We look for them every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's going to take some time. We aren't on a timetable. The coalition intends to stay here until the job is done.
What do you want down? To the left. Can't really pinpoint where they're coming from.
Many Afghans see the American and other Western troops as an occupation force, like the Soviet Red Army. And that's why they are supporting the call for jihad.
Many of the Taliban, after their defeat, went into Pakistan, where they went back to their original sponsors, the Islamic parties and the intelligence services in Pakistan. And their resurgence now, where we see Taliban attacks against the American forces, are taking place with the support of these Islamic groups in Pakistan.
Tapping on anti-U.S. feelings throughout the Muslim world after the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, radical Islamist groups in Pakistan and elsewhere are recruiting more volunteers than ever. Responding to George Bush's crusade against terror, jihad fighters have already started carrying out bombing attacks, not just against the U.S. government and military, but also against American and international civilian targets around the world.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
In a reciprocal fashion, the U.S. government is using this situation as an excuse to base troops abroad in the vicinity of oil resources, 3/4 of which happen to be located in Muslim countries.
We now have permanent bases in Iraq. We've had them in Kuwait for a while. We have permanent bases in Afghanistan. We are building permanent bases in Uzbekistan. We actually have 4 bases in Georgia. So if you draw a map that connects the dots between all of the bases that we have done since the Cold War ended, what you see is American military hegemony covering 90% of the globe's energy resources in terms of gas and in terms of oil.
In May of 2002, trusting that the U.S. military would bring peace for Afghanistan, President Karzai signs a treaty with the leaders of Pakistan and Turkmenistan for the construction of a $2 billion pipeline from Turkmenistan to the Indian Ocean. Turkmenistan and Afghanistan hope to generate much-needed income for their economies. Pakistan hopes to secure an oil route for itself. Its position would also allow Pakistan to control at least part of the oil supply to India. Washington, however, appears to recognize the potential for conflicts with the pipeline that would ultimately serve China's 1.5 billion consumers as well. Indeed, U.S. oil companies are now favoring a western route through the sparsely populated regions of Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and eastern Turkey towards the Mediterranean Sea, and eventually Europe and the United States. For this reason, the U.S. military is not even trying to control the Afghan warlords, whose persistent violence would hamper the pipeline's construction. In addition, continued unrest justifies a large U.S. military presence in Afghanistan that will remain as a deterrent to any other foreign intrusion into the region. Fighting terrorism is clearly not the reason for such a large deployment of troops, as clandestine terrorist cells are better fought by undercover agents and special forces. Is it a coincidence if massive U.S. military positioning happens to take place in Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, and other oil-rich regions of the world? Is fighting terrorism the real motive? Or is Washington more interested in grabbing whatever oil reserves are left, fueling terrorism and war as a result? But massive deployment requires massive manpower.
Imagine simultaneously tracking over 100 enemy targets on land, sea, and in the air from thousands of miles away.
Targeting America's youth, the U.S. military has souped up its presence on MTV-style television.
I am my own force. With the latest technology, training, and support, who I am has become better than who I was.
With enlistment down, recruitment efforts are now at an all-time high.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of all who threaten it. Navy, accelerate your life.
Well, again, I think we have our military is in fact too small to handle all the global responsibilities we do have.
Dick Cheney told us after 9/11 this was going to be a war that was not going to end in our lifetimes. It is a sequential war to control the last remaining oil reserves on the planet.
The future security of the United States depends upon the President's program for transforming the Middle East, and Iraq is the first step in doing so.